Hello and welcome to earlymusicsources.com. My name is Elam Rotem, and today we'll talk about the fascinating subject of historical translations of vocal music around 1600. Throughout the 16th century, with the flowering of the music press, it was very easy for music to end up in a place very far from its country of origin. In the case of instrumental music, this is unproblematic. Music is music. But in the case of vocal works, musicians and music lovers who didn't understand the original language in which a piece was composed had a problem. And so, from around the end of the 16th century, we see more and more translations of vocal music into different languages, in an attempt to make it accessible to new audiences. In this episode, we will look at this fascinating phenomenon. Let's start. Reusing existing melodies with new texts is a practice which is probably as old as vocal music. Just to give an example from our favorite time period, the song La Monica that we presented in our episode about nuns can be found with slight variations within a span of circa 100 years in at least 11 different texts of different natures, functions, and languages, from sacred songs in German and Dutch to highly erotic songs in French. This phenomenon of assigning a new text to an existing melody, whether in the same language or in another, is generally referred to as contrafactum, and can also be used in polyphonic music. Famously, in England, under the changing regimes, we find pieces in Latin and then as contrafacta in English, very often without being able to tell which version came first. These religious English contrafacta were mostly not translations of their originals, but simply new texts to the old music. When a contrafactum is aiming to preserve the original meaning of the text, just in another language, we get what is sometimes called singable translations. England, whose people had a great fascination with everything Italian at the end of the 16th century, is where we find the first substantial examples of such singable translations. In 1588, Nicholas Young published Musica Transalpina, Music from Across the Alps, a collection of continental madrigals, mainly Italian, that were brought to speak English, that is, translated into English. Many of the pieces are by Alfonso Ferrabosco the Elder and Luca Marenzio, but there are also pieces by others, such as Palestrina and Lasso, with a translation of Lasso's highly famous Suzanne un jour, here Susanna fair. In the preface, Young explained the motivation for having such translations. Italian songs are for sweetness of air very well liked by all, but most on account of them that understand that language. As for the rest, they either do not sing them at all, or at the least with little delight. Regarding the translations, which were made by a certain unnamed gentleman, Young was assured by experts that the accent of the words is well maintained, the descant not hindered, though some few notes altered, and in every place the due decorum kept. Let's see what he means by looking at a madrigal from his second volume of Musica Transalpina, Orazio Vecchi's Il Bianco e Dolce Cinio, here the White Delightful Swan. Some of you might know the earlier and more famous version by Arcadelt on which it is based. Let's start by listening to the original version in Italian.
Il bianco e dolce cigno cantando. Now, let's see Musica Transalpina's English translation. It is not only a literal translation, but it lines up word for word almost perfectly. Bianco with white, dolce with delightful, cigno with swan, cantando with singing, and more with dieth. As opposed to other kinds of translations that can be more free, here it is highly important that the words line up, as so much in the madrigal genre is based on the musical interpretation of single words. For example, here, the word cantando, singing, got given a little melisma by Vecchi, a typical word painting. By managing to translate cantando into sweet singing, the translator kept not only the textual meaning, but also the original musical effect. Let's listen to the English translation.
Delightful swan song, sweet singing, sweet singing, sweet singing, sweet singing, sweet singing,
In the next phrase, ed io piangendo, and I lamenting, we see again a one-to-one translation. Here, however, while the Italian io is composed of two notes, the one-syllable English I had to ignore the second note. These are the kind of note changes that Young was referring to in his preface, little adjustments when absolutely necessary. Clearly, however, making translations in this way is very restrictive, and from a literary point of view might result in questionable outcomes. Not so surprisingly, when an actual poet, Thomas Watson, decided to make such translations, his approach was different. Just 2 years after the first volume of Musica Transalpina, he published the first set of Italian madrigals Englished, not to the sense of the original ditty, that is, the text, but after the affection of the note. In his volume, which mostly contained pieces by Luca Marenzio, he made new poems that take inspiration from the originals, but are not committed to be translations. Sometimes they are very close, but sometimes very far away. However, he was committed to the music and the musical gestures. Let's see how he Englished Marenzio's Zefiro Torna. See here the original Italian text compared with the Watson English version and with the standard English translation. You see that Watson borrows literary imagery from the original poem and creates a new poem. Mostly, however, the borrowed images are not musically aligned with the original. For example, in the second line there is the word flowers, both in the original and in Watson's version. But on the moment it appears in Marenzio, ei fior, Watson has to play. However, just after it, the verb garrir, to tweet or to chirp, is aligned with Marenzio's little word painting of it, even if the words around it are not, and even if Watson had to add an extra note for a more correct underlay. But even in lines where very little is borrowed, Watson followed Marenzio's spirit. For example, in the line Giove s'allegra di mirar sua figlia, Jove is glad to see his daughter, Watson retained only the word allegra, to rejoice. But the new line that he wrote, greatly rejoiceth to but hear her named, fits very well to Marenzio's happy fanfare-like setting.
Greatly rejoiceth to but hear her name.
And so, as opposed to Musica Transalpina, Watson didn't translate madrigals, but made English contrafacta which are very often highly inspired by the originals, both by their text and music. Being a poet, this approach allowed him to end up with results which are more satisfying from a literary point of view. Interestingly, in Musica Transalpina there are also settings of Zefiro Torna, so it is possible to compare the two very different ways to English a madrigal. Feel free to pause the video and examine this carefully.
Thanks to the trend of such translated collections in England, and even if their incentive was sometimes financial, at the end of the day, more English people gained access to the Italian repertoire, which in turn helped English musicians develop their own distinctive English madrigal genre. But not only madrigals were translated, and not only into English.
In 1596, the Venetian composer Giovanni Croce published his 7 penitential psalms. Normally, the penitential psalms were settings of the Latin biblical psalm verses, but Croce's version, exceptionally, used a paraphrase of the text written in Italian. 3 years later, the pieces were printed again, but this time in Nuremberg, and instead of in Italian, they were in Latin. On the title page, it says that the pieces were translated into Latin for the pious use of those who are not versed in Italian. The translator, who like the translator of Musica Transalpina preferred to remain nameless, is referred to as a lover of music. 9 years after that, in 1608, an English translation was published in London. On its title page, it was declared that it was newly Englished. The reasons for making the translation were clarified in the preface. Myself often observing the general applause given these songs when I have heard them sung, though sometimes without the words. Here we get an idea of what people might have done when they didn't know the language. Simply sang it without the words, possibly with solmization syllables. He continues, I thought it would be very gratifying to many of our English lovers of music if they were translated or imitated in our tongue, since, owing to their want of understanding Italian, they are deprived of a chief part of their delight. For although the very concord of the note may sweetly strike the outward sense of the ear, yet it is the ditty, the text, which conveyed with the music to the intellectual soul by the organs of hearing, that doth touch the heart and stir the affections. The translator, alas another unnamed person, explained that the notes themselves are nice, but it is the text that touches the heart, and this is why it is essential to have the music in a language that you understand.
In some cases, composers aimed for a larger audience by having their music already printed in 2 languages. Let's see.
In 1590, the Italian composer Cesare de Zaccaria published in Munich a bilingual edition of his 4-part canzonette. Not only the title page is both in Italian and German, but also the music has text underlay in both languages. In the preface, he explained that he added the German text to the Italian so that those who are inexperienced in the Italian language and want to know the content of these songs are accommodated and helped. So that, however, the German text could be sung under the notes, one did not want to place more or fewer syllables in the rhymes than the amount found in the Italian. Therefore, it was not really possible to observe the rules of German prosody. While in Musica Transalpina the translator was strict, he still allowed himself to add or take away some notes when needed. Here, being even more limited by not being able to do so, Zaccaria feels that he must apologize for the highly compromised German text. In 1595, the English composer Thomas Morley did not publish a bilingual edition, but made a bilingual parallel publication. That is, he published 2 versions of his compositions at the same time, one in Italian, Il primo libro delle ballette, and one in English, the first book of ballets. The pieces in this collection take a lot of inspiration from existing pieces such as by Giovanni Giacomo Gastoldi and Orazio Vecchi. See, for example, the opening of Vecchi's So ben mica bon tempo, published 4 years before in 1591.
So ben mica bon tempo, so ben mica bon tempo, la 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 la.
Compare this with Morley's version, which copy the text, the rhythm, and general form.
So ben mica bon tempo, so ben mica bon tempo, la 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 la.
And now, let's see Morley's parallel English version, which ended up being one of the most popular English Renaissance songs nowadays.
Now is the month of May, when merry lads are playing, fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la.
as you might have noticed, the English text is not meant as a translation of the Italian. It is simply a new text in English.
As we already saw, not only English people wanted Italian music in their own language. There was a similar growing market in Germany.
Valentin Hausmann was a German composer, editor, musician, and a poet who published a lot of Italian music with German texts. In his 1606 edition of pieces by Luca Marenzio, he explained, "One finds many who do not understand a word of Italian and still like to sing Italian songs in that same language. Partly when such compositions are seen as pleasantly artful and graceful, and partly because the Italian language in itself is lovely." Here we get another perspective of the situation. Even if one doesn't understand the text, there is an appreciation of the sounds of the Italian language itself, which would get lost in translation. He, however, continues, "Because it seems ridiculous and odd to sing the text, and like parrots not to know what one sings,
Not to know.
I have thus let myself be persuaded, and for those who do not speak the Italian language, have made German texts for better use." 3 years later, he made a complete German edition of Morley's Ballette. The title explains that the ballette were previously set by Thomas Morley with Italian texts, but now, for the better use of those who are unfamiliar with the Italian language, given a new imprint with German texts. Notice that he doesn't say anything about translations, he just refers to new German texts. Indeed, while Hausmann follows the original form, syllable count, accents, and caesuras, the text can be close but also very far from the original. Let's listen to Hausmann's German version of Morley's hit, which, as you know now, is a ripoff of a piece by Vecchi.
Feinst Lieb, du wirst noch kommen, wie ich von dir vernommen. Fa-la-la-la-la-la, fa-la-la-la-la-la-la.
Charming. The fascination of Italian music in Germany did not end there. Famously, Heinrich Schütz was a very important ambassador of Monteverdi's new style in Germany. Some pieces of his are in effect contrafacta in German of Monteverdi's pieces. In one case, although it's not absolutely sure whether it was made by Schütz or someone from his circle, there is a German translation of Monteverdi's dramatic piece Combattimento di Tancredi e Clorinda. Sadly, only the tenor part survived, but since it is the biggest part in the piece, the testo, the storyteller, we can still get a decent impression of it. Let's listen to the original Italian from an excerpt from one of the many monologues of the testo.
Profondo scuro seno chiudeste e nell'oblio fatto si grande.
Now, when looking at the German version, it is clear that there was an attempt to translate it directly as much as possible. We can see, however, a little compromise. On fatto si grande, a feat so great, to express it in music, Monteverdi is using an expressive dissonant anticipation on a high note. In the German version, due to the challenge of this kind of translation, not only is this long note chopped up into 3 notes, but also the middle weak syllable of the word wichtige falls on a strong part of the beat, something which is considered not to be optimal. Let's listen.
Die du in deiner tiefen Stille und Tunken schoss, so eine sehr wichtige Tat bedeckest, die dadurch für dich.
Is the German translation as beautiful to sing as the original Italian? No. But the German-speaking audience who watched a performance of it, sometime in the middle of the 17th century, were able to enjoy Monteverdi's piece in a much more direct way than if it had been performed in a language they did not understand.
You might be asking yourself at this point, was only Italian music translated into other languages at that time? The answer is pretty much yes. But here is a very interesting exception with French air de cour translated into English.
In 1629, the English music lover Edward Filmer published a collection titled French Court Airs with Their Ditties Englished. In it, there are 17 airs de cour translated into English, mainly by Pierre Guédron. The pieces are presented in a typical English table format, with each of the parts printed in another direction, meant to be read when it is laid flat on a table. In a lengthy preface, Filmer explains that regarding the texts, I have no more than colored their form anew by changing their language. I have not invented the subject or made the matter. However, he also explains that normally music is made according to the text, but in his case, having the music already fixed, I have been forced by this new task for the better accord with the music, and that I confess that I have been generally more taken with the musical part than the poetical. To get an idea of the nature of these translations, let's have a look at the song Quel espoir de guérir, first published almost 20 years prior to its English version, With What Wings Can I Fly? When looking at the text, it's clear that the translation is pretty loose, but that much of the original was maintained. Let's see how it works with the music. We see that mourir, to die, is lined up with I die, and that amoureux, loving, is lined up with love kindled. We also see that the entire fourth line is perfectly translated and lined up, and that while the last line is not really so, at least the very distinctive but is. Let's listen to the entire song with the repeats being in Filmer's English.
This was a little taste of the interesting history of translations of vocal music. We hope you enjoyed it, and that it might have given you something to think about when preparing your next concert. Many thanks to Robbie, Emma, Ivo and Loïc for their singing. Don't forget to check the special page on our website with all the footnotes and other extra information. If you enjoy early music sources, feel free to support us on Patreon. Comment, share and like. See you next time at earlymusicsources.com.
Which I may